Hey everybody, today we are going to talk more about salt in our aquarium. I've been having a conversation with somebody and we've been talking about the difference in grain size in the kind of salt we use and whether or not this grain size really has an impact on the total volume of salt that we're putting into our aquarium. In other words, very fine-grained salt will pack densely together, and therefore a teaspoon of very fine-grained salt will contain more actual salt than a teaspoon of, say, a coarser ground salt or even a rock salt that has great big chunks and therefore lots of gaps and air spaces between the grains, and overall you will get less salt if you use the coarse ground salt. At least that's always been my understanding, and people have said that over the years. That's why if you're making a recipe that requires a precise amount of anything, salt, sugar, etc., you want to weigh it rather than measure it in a volumetric type measurement like a teaspoon. And so that's been the debate back and forth. But before we go any further than that, I have to make a correction because I've been wrong about something for a lot of years, and I was partially basing my argument on an incorrect notion. And I've said for years that there is a range of the amount of salt you can put in a freshwater aquarium. You can go anywhere from 1 teaspoon per gallon all the way up to 3 teaspoons per gallon, depending on your needs, depending on the type of fish, depending on the plants you have in your tank, etc. You can go anywhere from 1 teaspoon per gallon at sort of the bottom end of the spectrum, all the way up to 3 teaspoons per gallon, and you should still be fine. And I was told that that's not true. There is no range of how much salt. It's 1 teaspoon per gallon. And again, that teaspoon is a questionable number, but we'll get back to that. In fact, we're going to go do some testing and some measurements on that in just a little bit. But I decided I would double check on that because I've believed that for years, but I was told I was wrong about it, and so I dutifully checked, and sure enough, I saw immediately where I was getting confused, because when I looked at it, I said, see, I'm right. And then I had to do a double take and say, no, I'm not right. And I saw exactly where I got confused. The way it's written is 1 tablespoon per 3 gallons of water. So 1 tablespoon of salt per 3 gallons of water is how that's written. 1 tablespoon is the equivalent of 3 teaspoons. So what they're really saying is 3 teaspoons of salt per 3 gallons of water. And so just doing all those conversions and the numbers and the 1 and the 3, and just numbers easily get jumbled up in my head, and that was a prime example of where I came away from that thinking there was a range between 1 and 3 teaspoons per gallon of water. So I was completely incorrect about that. It is either 1 teaspoon per gallon or 1 tablespoon per 3 gallons. It's the same number no matter which way you want to say it. Again, 1 tablespoon is 3 teaspoons. So 3 teaspoons of water, salt in 3 gallons of water. So that's where I was getting confused about that. So it'll be interesting to see if my argument still stands up, because my argument was that it really doesn't make that much of a difference. Yes, there will be a difference in the total volume of salt at the end when you've measured out a fine grain versus a coarse grain. But is it a difference that matters? And my argument is no. And part of my argument is that when we're talking about table salt, we're seldom talking about rock salt or anything that's really coarsely ground. We're usually talking about anything that's typically your fairly fine grained stuff. And we can have a little look at a tiny bit of this. And you can see that is basic grains of salt, about what you'd expect from table salt. Now this is also table salt, but this is a coarse grind table salt. And we will be having a look at this too. You can see this has a much, much coarser texture to it. So you can imagine a teaspoon of this versus a teaspoon of what we just looked at is probably going to be a good bit different. And on top of that, I also got ice cream salt. This is rock salt. So if anybody does just have a hankering for rock salt, and they've got this on their table, and that's what you're putting in your aquarium, how much of a difference will that make in a volumetric type measurement? So we are going to go over to my work area, my washing machine, and we are going to first measure out teaspoons of each one. We're going to then weigh those teaspoons, find out exactly how much each one weighs, and I can tell you I've already done some preliminary experiments, and I was a little surprised with what I found out. But we're going to go have a look at that, and then we're going to take those teaspoons, we're going to dissolve them into water, and we're going to look at the TDS measurements before and after, fine, medium, and coarse, and see, is there really that much of a difference between one and the other? This is easy enough stuff to find out, so let's go do it. Alright, we are going to start by measuring out a teaspoon of the fine grain. And I debated whether or not to level it off, and I think I'm going to, just for consistency's sake. I did measure out a few and weigh them to see how consistent I was, and I'm fairly consistent with measuring them out, but I think just for the sake of this video it'll be better for everybody if I just measure it out that way. So that is 1 teaspoon of salt, and I know you can't see the measurement there, but it comes out exactly at 6 grams, like 1 teaspoon of salt is supposed to. If you actually look up how much does 1 teaspoon of salt weigh, it will tell you it's supposed to weigh 6 grams, and so that's exactly what we got from that. So the next one we are going to do is the medium grain stuff. And in this case I can get in there and scoop it out, and likewise we're going to level that off a little bit. And this comes out at 5.5 grams, so we are half a gram less than what the fine grain stuff was. Now I have to say, when I did that measurement by hand and I just sort of eyeballed how much I was putting in there and just sort of leveled it off, I actually got a heavier weight using the medium crystals, and then I got a heavier weight again when I used the coarse stuff, and so clearly that was my measuring rather than the precise measurement of using, you know, leveling it off with something. So this one is the one that's kind of difficult to level off. This is so coarse that it's going to knock a lot of it out of there, and it won't be nearly as level. So this, I think, by doing this, we're going to see a significant reduction in the amount of salt that's actually in there. It'll be much, much lighter, because when I did it again, I sort of leveled it with my finger rather than a flat surface like this. So we will see how much this is. Well, 5.4. So that is just a little bit less, but still less. So 6 grams for the fine stuff, 5.5 grams for the medium ground, or what this would be considered as coarse salt for table salt, if it ever focuses there. Anyway, there you go, coarse salt. Now I do want to address that this is sea salt for a moment. Chemically, we are still, when we get to the TDS measurements, we are still measuring or comparing apples to apples when we do the TDS measurement. All 3 of these salts are pure sodium chloride. I have had conversations in the past about sea salt and why it does not taste like the ocean. This is derived from seawater. But if you just evaporated seawater away and you had the white stuff at the bottom of the bucket and you scraped that up, that would taste like my instant ocean. It would taste like my marine salts. It would taste like ocean water, and that's not a good taste. This tastes like this, because once they get that crud at the bottom of the bucket, after evaporating the seawater away, they refine that and they remove all of the other mineral salts and impurities, and they keep the sodium chloride. So this is sodium chloride. This is sodium chloride, and this is sodium chloride. They're chemically identical, so when we get to the TDS part of the test, there will be absolutely no difference chemically between them, so that's not a concern. We are comparing apples to apples here. So what we're going to do for the TDS part of the test is we are going to turn the scale off and put that over here. We are then going to do a quart of water. It doesn't matter whether we're doing this into a gallon or not. We're going to do equal parts when we measure it, so all we're trying to find out is the differences between the three, and so as long as we're measuring equal parts of water with the same amount of salt in it, the actual gallonage and all that doesn't really matter. We are also going to start with one big jug of water back here, and that's what we're going to fill all of our cups up with. And then that way we will have one base water that will be the same temperature, and we will know the starting TDS of it. Not again that the starting TDS will necessarily matter, but we'll know that it's the same in all three examples, so we will not be having any variables there. And so this is a little higher than usual for my tap water. I'm surprised. We're coming in about 310, 311, 309, 311. So we'll call it 310 parts per million is what we're starting at with the TDS. Now again, that number doesn't really matter. What's important is we are using the same water for all three of these tests. So let's get 4 cups of water, 1 quart. And then we will take, you know what, let's bring the scale back so we can weigh it after we measure it, and then that way we will know exactly that we're still dealing with the same amount of salt. So let me get this poured out. Let me get this scraped off. Put it in the scale. And we are at 5.9 grams, so just under 6 grams on that one. I'm going to put it in there. We're going to dissolve it real quick. This one won't take too long to dissolve since it's such a fine ground salt. Once we get into the coarser stuff, I may sort of fast forward through this part a little bit. And that looks like it's already completely dissolved. Yep, there is nothing left in there. So let's see what our TDS is now. Don't know whether you're going to be able to see this or not. Probably not really. Alright, it takes 15-20 seconds to stabilize. And we'll press the hold button there. Can you see that? No, of course you can't see that. It says 7,253. We're going to write that down so I don't forget. So 7253. Let's rinse off the TDS meter. Let's dump out this water. Alright, medium ground salt this time. We had 5.5 on the first measurement, but we got a slightly different measurement on our first fine grain salt too. So let's see if we come out with the 5.5 again. See, even scraping it off like that, I'm at 5.8. So that's 1/10 of a gram difference between that and what we measured in the first one with the fine grain, which came out at 5.9. Alright, that should be well dissolved away enough. Let's rinse the meter again just to be sure. Turn it off, reset it. So we are sitting pretty steady on this one. And again, I know you're not going to be able to see it, but well, it says 7,038, so a little bit less. Remember, 7,253 was what we started with, and that was at 5.8 grams and 5.9 for the first set. And now let's rinse this off again. Alright, and 5.8 grams, so that is the same amount. So we're getting a little bit of fluctuation there. And now this one's probably going to take a little while to dissolve as well. Alright everybody, I got one little tiny pile of white stuff in the middle there that simply will not dissolve away, or certainly doesn't want to seem to dissolve away. So I'm wondering if, since this isn't really made for consumption, it's made for making ice cream. It even says not intended for human consumption. I'm almost wondering if this doesn't have some impurities in it, and I've clearly got some stuff in the bottom there that just will not evaporate or will not dissolve away into the water, and so this may have some impurities in it. It'll be interesting to see what the TDS number comes out on this one. So once again, I know you can't see that, but it says 6,912. So all three were within 350 parts per million of each other. So the initial measurement was 6 grams, 5.5, and 5.4. Then when I actually did the test and I measured them again, they came out much closer at 5.9, 5.8, and 5.8. And then the TDS for the fine was 7,253. TDS for the medium was 7,038. And then for the very coarse stuff, the rock salt, was 6,912. So let's go back to the tank and we will wrap it up with my final thoughts. Alright, now that told me pretty much everything I needed to know. I understand that that little experiment I just did was not conclusive by any means, but it just goes to show you that, as far as I could tell, there was more variation in the way I measured than there was between one kind of salt versus the next. And again, when we're talking about table salt and using table salt in our aquarium versus aquarium salt, every time I've ever bought aquarium salt or ever seen aquarium salt, that actually seems to be a little more chunky and a little more rocky than the table salt. So at worst case scenario, you could say if you're going to use the table salt, that's a very fine ground stuff, that's probably going to put you sort of on the upper end of how much sodium and chloride and TDS you're putting in the tank, versus if you're using a really coarse ground aquarium salt. And again, every time I've ever seen aquarium salt, it's always been the API brand. I've never seen other brands, but it's always been the API brand, and it's always been probably somewhere between what we saw as the medium grain stuff in this test and the coarse grain. And so again, we're still in that neighborhood. When you're talking about around 7,000 parts per million, 150 this way to 150 that way is not really much of a window of TDS. You know, if it was 100 and then there was a 50 part per million window one way or the other, that's significant. When you're at 7,000 parts per million, 150 parts per million one way or the other is just really not a significant number. And when you're talking about the sodium, and again the chloride not really being much of an issue at all, but the sodium being in the tank, you got to get into much higher amounts than a teaspoon per gallon, and that's why I think it's just simply measured at a teaspoon per gallon rather than size measurement. Now, having said that, I do think it's more of an American thing. When we measure stuff, we measure volumetrically rather than by mass. If you go to Australia or Europe, anywhere, they will usually measure things in grams or milliliters. They use the mass. So if your flour is finely ground or coarsely ground, or it's densely packed or it's lightly fluffy, it doesn't matter. If you've got 50 grams of flour, it's 50 grams of flour. You can pack it in there as tight as you want. It doesn't change anything. And that's where we do sort of fall apart. When we measure our coffee, we measure coffee by the scoop rather than by how many grams of coffee we're putting in our filters and so on and so forth. So it is better to measure by mass or by weight than it is by volumetric. But again, when we're talking about something like amount of aquarium salt we're putting in our tank, I stand by what I said, that it just really doesn't make that big of a difference if you're using a coarse ground stuff or a fine ground stuff. How you measure it is going to make more of a difference than anything. And I'll tell you, that's the only time I've ever measured a teaspoon of salt by leveling it off like that. Whenever I do a teaspoon of salt in my aquarium, I'm doing 125 teaspoons of salt or something like that. I measure that out in a big cup. I do the calculations and find out how many pints of salt that is before I would put it in a tank this size or whatever. So when you're talking about a tank this size, that little bit of difference, you know, it adds up because it's 125 teaspoons. If each teaspoon is just a little bit different, it's going to add up much more at the end. But again, look at how much total dissolved solids we'd be talking about, and how much. I still don't see it. I just don't really see it being that big of a deal. So make what you want out of that. I'm not going to come to any conclusions for you. I will just say that for my own personal aquarium use, I will simply not be that concerned about it when I'm using my table salt to salt an aquarium. On the rare occasion I do that. I don't do it very often, but I will occasionally put some salt in the aquarium. And I'm going to continue just using table salt that's untreated, doesn't have any iodide in it. And I'm going to do a teaspoon. I'm going to eyeball it out. I'm going to pour it until it's more or less roundish, and then that's going to be my teaspoon. I've always done it that way. I've never really had an issue with it, not that I know of anyway. I don't think I've ever caused any problems doing that. And so that's what I'm going to keep doing. But you just saw it for yourself. If you want to make a determination on that, if you think that, you know, number shift that we were looking at was significant enough that it concerns you, or you want to change the way you measure your salt or whatever, then by all means, I hope that was helpful for you. But again, I'm going to stick by my original conclusions and say it just really doesn't matter all that much. It just doesn't. So I'd be interested to hear your thoughts down below. I think I'm pretty much done with the salt topic here for a little while. I feel like I'm getting burned out on talking about salt. And so we will be talking about something else in the near future. Don't forget to do a live stream every Friday night and Sunday night, so make sure you're subscribed and you ring that bell. You won't miss those or anything else I've got coming up. So thanks for watching this one. See you real soon in the next one.